You are listening to Curious Cat, a podcast that examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. And I'm your host, Jennifer Holtz. Join me every week as I examine what it means to be a soul in a meat suit. Welcome to Curious Cat. If you listen to my interview with comedian and tarot reader Karen Rontowski, then you have at least a cursory knowledge of Edgar Cayce, who was also known as the sleeping prophet and the father of holistic medicine. I learned about him on an episode of the Art Bell tapes and immediately ordered There Is a River by Thomas Sugrue, his only authorized biography, and started to read it right away. Edgar Cayce, if you have or haven't heard of him, was born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky on March 18th, 1877. In his youth, after studying the Bible for days on end, he says an angel appeared to him. And she mentioned to him, curiously, that if he slept, he could learn anything. Well, he told his mom about this strange encounter. She was his confidant his whole life, but no one else. Then, as a student in the local schoolhouse, Edgar struggled to learn his lessons. When his uncle temporarily served as the teacher for the schoolhouse, he reported to Edgar's father, Leslie, also known as the squire, what a terrible student his nephew was. So angry and ashamed, Leslie came back home and hit the boy after he failed to learn his spelling lessons. Edgar then remembered that angelic visitor's words. They were that he could learn things if he slept. He asked his father to let him rest for a few minutes before he went on with his spelling lesson, and his father allowed it. So the boy fell asleep on his spelling book, and when he woke up, he had his father test him. And they were both shocked to find out that Edgar had a photographic memory of the entire reader's contents. So he went on to be this amazing student, and that would follow him forever. He would just sleep on his lessons and know them by heart. And it's interesting to also note that at the time, his father was pretty angry. He wasn't delighted by the fact that his son knew the spelling book backwards and forwards. He thought it was some sort of trick, and that before he hit his son, he was playing a joke on him. So it wasn't until Edgar was hurt during a ball game as a boy, and he sustained a painful injury that just wouldn't go away. It was nagging him. And that's when he had a new level of his psychic skills become apparent. So he fell asleep, and in his sleep, unbeknownst to him, he recited his medical diagnosis, the condition, how it came about, and the exact prescription for healing. So when Edgar woke up, he found his parents staring at him, surprised. But they followed that advice he'd uttered in his sleep, and soon Edgar was as good as new. That's how he's got his name, the Sleeping Prophet. Later in life, Edgar Cayce was asked by a Dr. Munsterberger of Harvard if there was a tradition of psychic power in his family. And Cayce answered, this is his exact quote, "They say my grandfather was a water witch. He would walk around with a forked hazel twig in his hand and tell the farmers where to dig their wells." He went on to say, "There's nothing funny about my father, except that snakes love him, and he hates them." He explained further, they used to follow him home from the fields. They would wrap themselves around his hat brim if he laid it down on the field. This led his father to abandon farming as his profession. So Edgar Cayce was a lifelong devout Christian. And he would always have a concern, a deep concern about the origins of his knowledge, of this psychic knowledge when he slept. It was a theme that would haunt him throughout all of his days and be the reason he lived at the edges of destitution until his death in 1945. His mother, and not only his confidant, but that was his chief counsel here, even in this Christian realm. And she said that he must always be vigilant, like remain in God's good graces and make sure to not corrupt his abilities, or else he might end up unknowingly serving the devil. Edgar Cayce took this to mean he should never earn money with these talents. I'll get into it more in more detail soon, but in his life, he did upwards of 14 to 22,000 readings. We have a record of 14,000, but they say that there could be 8,000 or more that he did before they started actually transcribing them and filing them away. But those readings, giving comfort, providing valuable medical advice, a path to healing for countless individuals, even in one very dramatic series of readings, he interceded in a suicide attempt. So even with all that in place, he would not take a dime. In fact, many wrote letters to Edgar Cayce, and in the letter, they included cash, which he always returned with a letter to them in the name of serving God with his talents. But he had to eat, so Edgar Cayce endeavored to find other ways to make his livelihood. First, he helped his father sell insurance, and that didn't go so well. Then he learned the art of photography, and he set up a studio. His studio in Alabama would tragically burn down not once, but twice, and leave him deeply in debt. It took him years to dig himself out of that. Still, though, he would not take money for his readings. What I've read from not only his only authorized biography, There Is a River, by Thomas Sugrue that I mentioned at the top, but elsewhere scouring the internet, Cayce was not a bitter man in any way, shape, or form, though he might have had reason to be. He had some business partners that, while Cayce was in that sleeping state, would ask him where to invest money, where to look for oil, and other things, taking advantage of his abilities for their own selfish pursuits. Cayce left those partners, but from all that I read and studied, he didn't wish them ill will. Edgar Cayce went on to do readings for many famous people, including Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, Woodrow Wilson, Marilyn Monroe, Irving Berlin, and George Gershwin, just to name a few. He transcribed readings. Those transcribed readings are online, and if you want to read them, they're there. They're with his, I'll mention it later, but he set up a hospital, which also has an association with it. And you can become a member and read all those records, but you'll, have a hard time unless you look at what other internet sleuths have tracked down. You may not be able to find out or pair the reading with the actual famous person because they left those anonymous. The readings are numbered and the subject is the first part of the number, and then the actual reading or how many they did for that person or entity are the second number because there's a dash in between. But his work itself would culminate in the building of a hospital that still stands to this day in Virginia Beach, Virginia. This was necessary because Edgar Cayce had no medical training at all, and he was eyed with skepticism by anyone in the medical community. The way he spoke when he was asleep was as though many capable doctors and shaman were communicating through him. It was undeniable, like his depth of knowledge and understanding. It was flawless. It was jaw-dropping. But even that wasn't enough for most doctors to feel compelled to adhere to his prescribed cures. They always frowned, even though he had thousands of cases where it'd been exactly what the person needed. But this left Cayce frustrated, and he felt the only true answer would be to build a hospital where the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists, the osteopaths that believed in him would be employed. And Cayce could do his readings there, and the patient could be treated immediately. So his treatments varied. I mean, they were all very specific to certain patients, but a lot of people have grouped them together because in certain cases with certain maladies that people have that are similar, they have followed the same prescribed regimen that he recommended under hypnosis. But his cures often included specific medicines, sometimes like tonics that people would have to create. I'm thinking of one that involved sage, and other things like that. They would also include massage or electrical pulses and often dietary changes. He created, in fact, his own nutritional chart, which he did not follow, which I thought was funny, but he advised people to avoid eating fried foods, red meat, especially pork, coffee with cream and sugar, and he asked that people eat at least 2 meals a week that were 100% vegetables grown above ground. Watercress. Also, he really, really believed in the power of watercress too, and drinking fresh water. One place where I learned about Edgar Cayce, and I really did a deep dive because I'm really interested in the subject of reincarnation. He, very early on, he did a reading where he acknowledged reincarnation. And it's interesting to note that karma, and he linked it with reincarnation. He said that in a lot of readings, the soul would come back and try to basically relearn or do better this time around. But karma itself is a word that's Sanskrit, and it means work, deed, or act. And it's been interpreted to mean cause and effect, if you're familiar with the term. The Edgar Cayce readings indicate there isn't karma between people, but with ourselves personally. The idea being that we experience our soul through interaction with others and glimpse facets of ourselves through that interaction. We may be disheartened, angry, even bitter about why something happened to us. Truth is, even according to the sleeping prophet, is we may never know the whys, but according Cayce and ARE, which is his association, what's important is that we choose how we choose to respond. I'm sure, like me, you've heard that term before, like a lot, but what they wrote next took it to another level. In fact, they said, the way we respond to any given situation determines the next experience to be called into action. So I've heard it said before that all we can control is our reaction, but this careful wording says that in a different way that calls to mind those choose your own adventure books of my youth. Your reaction chooses what you experience next. So I'll use myself as an example. After my father died, I grieved. And then one day, after a string of feeling lighter days, I pressed that sore spot and I cried for the loss of my father. So I had this thought that I'd become addicted to that raw emotion that his death brought forward. I mean, of course I miss him. I'll always miss him. Of course, I can cry over him every now and again, but my need to feel real, raw emotions, well, that is real, and it indicates that I need to be present in my life and the spectrum of equally raw and real emotional opportunities that my life holds. So My choose my own adventure is to live in the moment, be present in my life. It's a different way of operating, and I'm having richer experiences, like more interesting days because of my choices. So back to Edgar Cayce and reincarnation. First, from an Art Bell tape I listened to this morning during my run. Did you know that reincarnation was in the Bible until a council of men voted it out? Yeah, I just learned that today. The year was 553, and the group was known as the Second Council of Constantinople. The reason for believing in reincarnation is not so that we can dwell upon the past, but that we might make better use of the present. So there was an interesting case reading that Edgar Cayce took, 3517-2. The patient is told his problem is karmic and he needs to be healed as such. So he had to make a change in the present in order to heal that past karmic garbage, that past karmic baggage, I guess I should say. So I found a website that actually delved into Cayce's 10 weirdest readings from CayceUniverse.com. So Cayce Universe biographers Sydney and Nancy Kirkpatrick, it's actually Sydney he has like a YouTube video that I found really interesting. I have the links in the show notes for you. The first reading he mentioned in the weirdest readings, actually, it ends up not being 10. It's a whole lot more than that, but he grouped them together. So this one is 5756-13, and he calls it the House of Clay reading. And he wants to, he indicates at the very beginning of this video that there's only and I told you there was like 14 to 20,000 readings that we know that Cayce did, but only 15 to 20 of those readings total have a source stop and identify themselves like an angel that identify themselves to him. So a whole gaggle of people in this reading came forward to help Cayce gather the information. That was one of the things that made it interesting. He also, the author, Sydney Kirkpatrick, goes on to note that this is reading 5756, and he says that the 5,000 series is the grouping of all the strangest readings. Like others in the series include 5748, which is the Egypt readings. 49 is the Jesus readings. 50 is the Mayan civilization readings. 51 is numerology. 52 is psychic source readings. 53 is specifically reincarnation readings. There's solar and cosmic systems readings, soul entanglement, sunspot readings, Methodist prayer group readings. But he just wanted to describe, if you get a chance to have a glimpse at those, the archive of readings, dive into the 5,000s and you'll find some very interesting stuff. So the 5756-13 that he talks about, and its companion reading 14, in the description, Edgar Cayce says the reading is volunteered by him, which means it wasn't about the subject per se, what he brought forward during the reading, that it just came out of him. And it was interesting because only 14 to 15 other readings among thousands were voluntary, like this one, or spontaneous. So that was another interesting facet of this one. Another in that category is 5756, and this reading is only 2 sentences long. Cayce jumps in at some point and says, there are many in the spirit plane that have not chosen to come back to Earth. He mumbled something that they weren't able to hear, but then he said, Lincoln, there are many about us now. So it led the people transcribing to believe that maybe Lincoln chose not to come back and reincarnate. Cayce has, let's see, this, I was talking to you about this reading, and Cayce had just given this depressing reading for his wife's best friend, Estella. She had cancer and there was no cure. It was like too far along to be cured. And Edgar Cayce said as much. The deceased relatives of Stella asked permission to come through. And Cayce said yes. And many, many people came forward. It's funny that almost a busload of people came forward. Her uncle, her grandfather, her brother that she had loved that had died before her, on and on it went. Her grandfather, who built the family house, he says during the reading that he's building a huge house in the other realm, in the great beyond, in my words, and it is good and well. So in the subsequent reading, I was telling you about the companion 114. Edgar says the soul lives on. The body has been released from a house of clay. So that's what he had to say, is basically our spiritual essence has always been and will always be, and our bodies are just a house of clay. They're meant to just dissolve back. They're a temporary vessel, which I thought was pretty beautiful and very amazing. The bigger message from both is also that your deceased loved ones are there with us always. They've gone nowhere. Another interesting reading the author Kirkpatrick brought forward was reading 3817-1, and he called this one Dead But Doesn't Know It Yet. So it was strange then, and it's strange now, but this reading was conducted in Selma, Alabama, and it was volunteered at the beginning of a Chicago businessman's reading. And remember, volunteered means this is information that comes forward and it's actually not connected to the reading he's about to do. Edgar says his former neighbor, who's been dead a decade, is only now becoming aware that he died, which Edgar called being in the borderland, the border between the living and the dead. So that was kind of interesting. In reading 304-49, the last reading that was given for Edgar's father, Leslie, who everybody called the Squire. So right before this reading, the Squire had made an extensive trip to visit two of his daughters. And Edgar's reading is that the body is to be made comfortable for impending death. The last sentence of that reading is, "We are through for the present." And that's the strange, interesting part that caused Sidney Kirkpatrick to add it to his most unusual readings list, because the sentence suggests there's more work to be done in the future, right? And there was. Edgar's son Hugh said after the Squire's funeral that strange noises, ghostly noises, were occurring in his grandfather's old room. Even the postman reported a ghost. In fact, he would no longer deliver mail inside of the Cayce house because of the noises and the occurrences. It freaked him out. Edgar investigated. He came downstairs with the good news and with the bad news. So the bad news was that, yes, Leslie, his father, was back. The good news was he said he'd only be there a few more days because he was trying to straighten out his papers before he left. He also made a note during the reading not to interrupt him or try to communicate with him because he would just get frustrated because he couldn't talk back. In reading 5756-5, again, a 5,000, so a really odd one, it's a voluntary reading, and it was pressed upon Edgar that the spiritual realm believes in what he is doing and creating. They were rooting for the association that he was creating to do well and the hospital to be built. There was a series of readings that he did, which I think are really pretty telling. A family begged Edgar to intercede in a suicide attempt, but the person's free will could not be impinged upon. So that was a very interesting thing I found in that reading is he had to appeal to the person that was considering suicide's higher self, and their higher self said, no, I'm on my own path and I have free will. So Edgar did 28 readings total because the family every day would come to him, please tell us how he's doing, this patriarch and their family, and where is he at? 28 readings later, and the suicidal man returned home safe and sound. And when he returned, he confirmed many, many, many of the facts that were gathered by Edgar in those 28 readings. I mean, very detailed, like he was surrounded by the ocean at one point. He was standing amidst tombstones in a cemetery at one point. He wrote a beautiful and long goodbye letter explaining why he had to kill himself to his family. That was one of the readings, and he actually brought them the letter when he came home. But the whole time, Edgar was able to, respect and honor that the man had free will, and there was nothing that Edgar Cayce or his guides could do to intercede. So if you're wondering what his source was, Edgar Cayce was, he had this Christian background, and he was really disturbed at who was his source, and he was always trying to come to terms with, is it a Christian type source? And he said that it was a greater set of records, the Akashic records, and that were like the great gathering of all the knowledge that had ever been and will ever be, that he was being tapped into and being told. He has made 7 prophecies that some say have yet to come true. And I wanted to go through those before we close. The first is that man will extend his normal lifespan. So this is in reading 244-2. Our lifespan has been increasing due to better nutrition, food, all of those types of things, better, clean running water. The second prophecy is we will discover the design for a self-fueling perpetual motion machine. So many say the emphasis on renewable resources that's happening right now and energy conservation will make this prophecy a reality in our lifetimes. And listening to ancient alien sleuths, the tech is already known now, but has not been shared widely, at least not yet. The third prophecy that Edgar Cayce made is there would be conflict in the Persian Gulf, specifically Syria and Libya, which has definitely occurred and is ongoing in some cases. His fourth is there would be a new root race that will evolve. So Edgar's information suggests that humanity's consciousness will continue to evolve and expand over time. That gives me goosebumps when I first read that, because I am seeing it happen. The people that are listening to even my little podcast that are breaking free of some of these old archetypes, these old mind loops that they were born into, I'm seeing it happen. They're expanding their thinking on some things. So Edgar Cayce, though, stated that this expansion of consciousness could be viewed throughout the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Again, those Christian roots, you see them, right? From the readings perspective, the next great evolution would be tied to the development of what Cayce termed the 5th root race. It was an evolutionary occurrence that would mark a new age and a new understanding of humanity's relationship to God. And I know it's just a Pollyanna in me, but I really do feel like we are there now. We're on the cusp of it. The 5th prophecy is, will the 3 halls of records be discovered? Which is another name for those Akashic records. So according to Edgar's readings, the people of Atlantis knew their civilization was about to be destroyed. And as a result, they hid identical records of the Atlantean civilization in Bimini, in Egypt, and in the Yucatan. So numerous readings contend that this hall of records will be discovered. Between the Sphinx and the river was specifically stated by Edgar Cayce in one of his readings. So the 6th prophecy is, what is the shape of the world to come? Decades ago, Edgar Cayce predicted great things for China and its people. He went so far as to say that eventually China would become the cradle of Christianity as applied in the lives of men. That was his exact quote from a reading. I think of the protests going on now in China, and I wonder. He went on to caution that it would take a long time to manifest, but it was the country's destiny. His exact words from reading 3976-29 are, "Yeah, it is far off as man counts time, but only a day in the heart of God, for tomorrow China will wake." His seventh and final reading is, "Will there be a second coming of Jesus?" Cayce's readings spoke often of Jesus and included much about his lost years, those years that were never addressed in the Bible. But he also spoke of Jesus's return, saying, "What is meant by the day of the Lord is near at hand." That as has been promised through the prophets and the sages of old, the time and halftime has been and is being fulfilled in this day and generation, and that soon there will again appear in the earth that one through whom many will be called to meet those that are preparing the way for his day in the earth. The Lord then will come even as ye have seen him go. And that's from his reading 262-49. I mentioned about the reincarnation. I did a deep dive on it, and I just wanted to add a couple other notes about it because he's not alone in his belief, at least through his readings, that there is reincarnation. In fact, most of the major religions of the world believe in reincarnation. And as I mentioned about the Constantinople Council, they actually took out reference of reincarnation from the Bible, but actually, even in Christianity, it's acknowledged still in a few places in the Bible that reincarnation is real. It exists. But among the people that believe in reincarnation are Benjamin Franklin. He wrote and distributed versions of his own epitaph, the body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms, but the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. Henry Ford said about reincarnation, "I adopted the theory of reincarnation when I was 26. Work is futile if we cannot utilize the experience we collect in one life in the next. When I discovered reincarnation, it was as if I had found a universal plan. Time was no longer limited. I was no longer a slave to the hands of the clock. Genius is experience. It is the fruit of long experience in many lives. The discovery of reincarnation put my mind at ease." Even author Rudyard Kipling said this about reincarnation: "They will come back again, as long as the red earth rolls. He never wasted a leaf or a tree. Do you think he would squander souls?" Edgar Cayce's last reading on September 17th, 1944, was for himself. This comes from crystallinks.com, and the link is in the show notes. He was now receiving thousands of requests for assistance. His own readings had repeatedly warned him that he should not try to undertake more than 2 sessions a day. But many of the letters he received were from mothers worried about their sons on the battlefields, and Cayce felt he could not refuse them his aid. His last reading told him that the time had come for him to stop working and rest. It was New Year's Day, 1945. Edgar Cayce announced that he would be buried on the 5th of January. He was right. Edgar Cayce suffered from a stroke and died on January 3rd, 1945. He was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. 10 years earlier, Cayce had written a brief account of his work. The life of a person endowed with such powers is not easy. For more than 40 years now, I have been giving readings to those who came seeking help. 35 years ago, the jeers, scorn, and laughter were even louder than today. I have faced the laughter of ignorant crowds, the withering scorn of tabloid headlines, and the cold smirk of self-satisfied intellectuals. But I have also known the wordless happiness of little children who have been helped, the gratitude of fathers and mothers and friends. I believe that the attitude of the scientific world is gradually changing toward these subjects. Please check the show notes because there's a lot more to learn about this amazing man, the sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, and his life and his work. I hope you're curious about it and you give it all a peek. Thanks for listening to Curious Cat. Huge gratitude to my art director and my audio engineer who are geniuses. And if you need those skills, please click on their links in the show notes and reach out to them. Until next time, stay curious. I love you.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Are you looking for a new podcast that appeals to your scientific curiosity, but is also a little bit spooky?
Show me how I died in a past life.
Well, look no further, because this cat is where it's at.
He had concerns about the ethics surrounding AI, feeling they had achieved consciousness.
Curious Cat Podcast examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. Listen every week with your host, Jennifer Holtz, as she and her guests explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit.
We were healing karma together. They were all kind of predestined to resolve something.
Listen on all your favorite streaming apps and continue the conversation on Twitter at CuriousCatPodCA, or find Jennifer and all her links at Jennifer L. Holtz, spelled HOTES.com.